Alright guys, welcome to 9.3 part 2, where we're going to look at the rest of interdependencies between species. Alright, we're going to pick up from where we left off last time, which now we're going to look at energy sources. So when we think of ecosystems, we need to understand it from the point of view of the movement of energy, right? And it all starts from two sources in the world, right? The first one is the sun, which drives the very crucial process of photosynthesis. And most of the Earth's ecosystem gets their energy from the sun, and the sun provides energy to mainly two groups, right? You either have plants, and then you also have bacteria. And so the plants will drive mainly terrestrial ecosystems, whereas your bacteria and your algae will drive many of the aquatic ecosystems. And then there's a subsection of them which also come from hydrothermal vents. So now hydrothermal vents sit at the bottom of the sea floor or the ocean floor, and it's actually a second source of energy. Heat from the earth in the vents will actually drive a second process called chemosynthesis, and chemosynthetic bacteria are able to capture that energy and make their own food and generate a new food web. As a result of that, there's no sunlight, it happens in complete darkness, and one of the cool things about it is that they reckon that it could also be an alternate theory for the origin of life. It could have actually started down here as opposed to up on the surface. Now, regardless of either one, if an organism is able to produce their own energy in the form usually of glucose from inorganic materials, we call that organism a producer, right? So either photosynthesis or chemosynthesis. If the organism can do either one, it is considered an autotroph, right? So for plants, that's photosynthesis, but for those chemosynthetic bacteria, it will be chemosynthesis, right? So when we have a producer, it's the production of that, we call that primary production, right? The collective, or the term used to collectively refer to producers producing their own energy source in an ecosystem and how much of it is being produced, right? Or the biomass of all the plants. Now, producers have different environments. So if you are thinking about a terrestrial one, like a rainforest or a temperate forest, it's most likely going to be the plants, the ferns, and the mosses. If it's like a cold environment, it could probably be the phytoplankton in the water. Or if it's like a marine environment, like a kelp forest, it's going to be the algae, which is a group of organisms that is neither, plants, animals, or bacteria or anything like that. Now, from the producers, how do you get energy to flow through the ecosystem? Yeah, it happens via consumption. So a consumer or a heterotroph is an organism that's going to get the energy by usually eating whatever the other organism is. So when a consumer eats a producer, we call that a primary consumer, because it is a herbivore. It's going to eat plants or algae or bacteria or whatever. And then when you have a consumer that consumes another consumer, then it's going to be called a carnivore or a secondary consumer. As you can see, it works its way down. Tertiary is the third level, and then quaternary is the fourth level. And when you have an organism that sits at the top of the food chain, we call that the apex predator, okay? Now, here is a terrestrial food chain where you have kind of the plant, which leads to the insect, to the mouse, to the snake, and then the hawk, right? And the hawk being probably the apex predator in this case. And then here's an aquatic one, right? Where you have phytoplankton that photosynthesize in the water. Then you have tiny little zooplankton, which are kind of like little microorganisms that eat the phytoplankton. And then you have fish that will eat zooplankton, and then maybe bigger fish, and then you have killer whales, right? And then the killer whale will most likely be the apex predator then. Now, organisms can also be both producers, organisms that consume both producers and consumers, like plants and animals, are what we call omnivores, because omni means all, and they eat, all those different types. Okay, food chains. So we represent that flow of energy using a food chain. So a food chain tells us the flow of energy and the feeding relationship between the organisms. A food chain is a single line, whereas a food web is multiple lines, right? And in general, when we're talking about food chain, the arrow always points in the direction of energy movement, and therefore it should always be pointing towards the predator and not the prey. So, we're saying that the energy has moved from the plant to the insect when the insect consumes the plant, right? If the arrow goes the other way, we're saying that plants eat insects, and that would be not true. On the other hand, the food web shows multiple lines of energy transfer, and you can see here the food web showing from plants to insects, and you can see that even though it's called a food web, it's not actually shaped like a web. It actually is generally moving in one direction, which is in this case up. You can move in any sort of direction you want, but in generally speaking, in this particular picture here, you can see that the energy is moving up and up and up, and then the red-tailed hawk being the apex predator. Now, you're going to probably notice also that some organisms occupy more than one level. So for example, here's your omnivore. The grasshopper mouse will eat both the grasshopper and it will also eat the brittlebrush down here as well. So that's an omnivore that's there as a result of that. Okay. We also use the term trophic level to refer to the level at which the organism is occupying that particular food chain or food web. Okay, and the word troph, it means nourishment, and so and so those terminologies are very helpful to kind of look at the way in which the organism is going to interact with each other, right? So the first trophic level is actually the plant, right? And the plant is the first trophic level and it's the producer. At the second trophic level, you have the primary consumers, which are your herbivores. At the third trophic level, you will have your carnivores, which is your secondary, and you just kind of keep moving up. All right. And in generally speaking, as you move up, there is a limit to how much energy is able to successfully move up the food chain as a result of that. Okay. Now, one of the limitations of using the food chain or food web system to represent things getting eaten is that, we often think of it when it's eaten when it's still alive. But the reality is that, sometimes organisms are dead before they get eaten. And that doesn't neatly fit in a food chain or a food web, because an organism that eats something that's dead isn't necessarily its predator, if that makes sense. And so you have to also remember that there are decomposers in every food chain and food web as well. And they play an important role in making sure that the nutrients in the environment is being recycled, essentially. Okay. So you can have a decomposer, and a decomposer is a heterotroph. In other words, it has to eat something to survive. It can't produce its own energy, but it will eat a decomposing or a dead organic matter. And so, if a lion on the savannah dies and it gets eaten by vultures, the vulture is not the predator of the lion, but it is the decomposer of the lion, right? Decomposers are consumers, and they can include, bacteria, fungi, and other protists as well, as, mushrooms and animals like worms and birds like vultures and so forth, right? You can have a category of decomposers called a detritivore. Now, a detritivore is an organism that decomposes by ingesting and eating it internally, right? And that sounds like a weird distinction, but it's kind of an easy way for us to figure out what most things do and differentiate between, the vulture, which is a detritivore. It's going to eat and put the food in its stomach, from something like, for example, a bacteria or a fungus or, a mold, which doesn't ingest it internally, but rather actually just eats away at the food, and we call that a decomposer, right? Basically, without decomposers, things don't rot. Now, it's so intuitive that we often think of, when something dies, it's going to naturally rot. But the only reason why something rots is because the cells in it is dead, it spills and it breaks, and then something is going to then consume and eat it, and that thing that's consuming and eating it is going to remove all of that from the environment. If you don't have that decomposer, that thing that's dead is going to just stay there as a pile of mush, but it's never going to disappear and rot and stink up and so forth because of it. Okay. In every ecosystem, we also have to think about what we call the keystone species, despite the fact that, ecosystems can be quite large and complex. Some ecosystems are very heavily reliant on one or few particular species that play a really critical role, and we call that the keystone species. And it was named after the keystone in an arch back in the old days, where that final block is the thing that actually keeps the arch up. And if you remove that final block, the arch will actually collapse. And when left unchecked, the ecosystem can become permanently altered or even collapse when you remove the keystone species. Okay, so here's an example, right? Imagine you have phytoplankton, and then you have zooplankton, and then you have fish, and then you have predators. And then imagine if, because we overfish and we remove the apex predator from the top here, what you're going to see is that there's going to be an effect of the population of apex predators going to drop. Now, that's going to cause the foraging fish to actually increase quite significantly. There's nothing to eat them, so they're going to obviously eat heaps. And then what happens is they, in turn, are going to be so widespread that they're going to start over-consuming the zooplankton, which then result in an overproduction of the phytoplankton. So you see this flow-on effect occurring, and we call that a trophic cascade. When you remove a keystone species, it's not just going to affect the population of the species, or not just even the thing that is directly below it or above it, but it's going to then have a flow-on effect or a cascading effect to the whole ecosystem. And most of the time, that flow-on effect is top-down. By removing an apex predator, it actually destabilizes the rest of the ecosystem, and some things are going to be out of control, whereas other things are going to plummet. However, trophic cascades can sometimes also be bottom-up as well, where you remove the bottom, and then that causes a widespread collapse of all the ones on top as a result of that removal. Okay, now here's a few examples. So great white sharks in North America are a keystone species. In fact, a lot of great white sharks are keystone species. When you remove the apex sharks from some of the waters around of North Carolina, what they noticed was that, all of these apex predators here, their population, as they dropped as a result of overfishing and killing the shark for like flake and all those kind of things, what happens is the animals that are in between the sharks are actually increasing. And so the mesopredators, these animals in between, like skates, other types of smaller sharks and rays and so forth, their population actually increases significantly, right? And as a result of that, because of that increase, then the bay scallop, the prey of these meso species, they actually as a result has plummeted and dropped, and that's going to be a bad thing for that particular ecosystem. Another example is otters, sea otters and kelp forests. Now, this is a really cool example because, the sea otter is pretty much the largest member of the weasel family. And they're one of the few animals that are actually capable of using tools. And you often find an otter using rocks to dislodge and break open prey. And they feed on crustaceans like crabs and things like that. And they also feed on sea urchins, which are these things right here. And they use those rocks to actually break it. And actually, otters actually have like a favorite stone that they actually like to keep with them, and they actually sleep with their stones and stuff like that. Now, the problem was that the sea otters were hunted quite extensively for their fur, which is, the thickest fur of any land mammal, up until 1911. So the population of otters was actually, took a really big nosedive as a result of that. Now, the problem with that was that the sea otters were feeding on things like sea urchins, which when you remove the otters means that there was nothing eating the sea urchins, and the populations grew out of control, right? And so that overpopulation of sea urchins meant that they could just graze across the sea floor, and they actually dislodged the kelp that's down the bottom. They dislodged the kelp from the sea floor, and then the kelp would kind of float away in the ecosystem, and these great big kelp forests would collapse as a result of this problem. And so the disappearance of the sea otters led to also the overpopulation of sea urchins, which led to the disappearance of the kelp, and then the collapse of the ecosystem because all these other organisms like fish and so forth then don't survive there. Right? We can represent that by a series of arrows depicting that change. And so here is the original food web with the sea otters. And so there's your kelp and your other algae, and there's all these interactions that are occurring. But the key one you want to note is this one here, right? The sea urchins and the sea otters, which is now keeping that and all of this in check. However, when you remove the sea otter, when it was removed here, right, overpopulation here meant the destruction of the kelp forest down here, and that decrease meant that the food web here, the eating of the kelp by the sea urchins increased, And then that created problems because the disappearance of kelp means smaller fish and invertebrates also disappeared, which then meant that larger crabs and larger fish also disappeared. So all of these organisms disappeared because of the disappearance of the sea otter. And then as a result, other things like your microscopic plankton grew out of control, which might have increase or reinforce the effect of sea urchins that also eat them, or the sea stars. And so that's going to be a big problem because obviously, that you had 10, 15 different species down to 2 or 3, and that's a pretty big collapse. Okay, we're going to switch gears. We're going to take a look at population dynamics. Now, this last component is really looking at, on a conservation level, how do we look after a population to prevent the population from going extinct or collapsing as a result of that, right? So biologists are really interested in this particular area of ecology because you want to analyze the population. You want to identify what are some of the big factors that are affecting this population to make sure that they survive and to save the population if they are struggling, right? This is the classification chart for the level of threat that is experienced by different species. So you can have things, what we call the least concern. These are things that are widespread and we're not really worried about their population. Rats, raccoons, and all those kind of animals that are widespread everywhere. And then you have a variety of categories where this one is near threatened, and then you have vulnerable, endangered. Endangered is probably the most well known. If something is endangered, it means it's really there's not a lot of it left. And then you can have critically endangered, which is even worse. And then you can have being extinct in the wild, and then you can just have extinct altogether, right? Now, we learn about these population dynamics so that we can, figure out what are some of the ways that we can prevent organisms from going extinct in their particular environments, usually because of human activities, right? Now, the characteristics of the populations we have to try and figure out is, a variety of different factors. The size, how many individuals are in the population, the density, the number of individuals or biomass per unit area, their distribution, how well they're spaced out, the age structure, how many young, old, and adult individuals, the birth rates, the death rates, immigration, and then also their growth rates. By tracking one or more of these characteristics, we can ensure that the population remains healthy, and every species will have different rates of each of these parameters, okay? Primarily speaking though, when we look at population growth, there are two things to consider: primary ecological events and secondary ecological events. Primary ecological events are the 4 things that really affect a population at a primary level, right? And that is how many individuals are being born in the population, or birth rate, how many individuals are dying, the death rate, the immigration rate, how many individuals are moving into that population from somewhere else, and how many individuals are leaving. And in general, a population will grow when the birth rate and the immigration rates are higher than the death rates and the emigration rates, right? So, you add birth rates and immigration rates, and then you take away death rates and emigration. Pretty arbitrary, right? So long as a population, there are more individuals being born than dying, and then there are more individuals going in than going out, the population should grow. So if you take the metric and you go, so for example, let's say you have 1,000 individuals, and then every year, about 100 of them are going to be born, 65 are going to migrate, 37 will die, and then 25 are going to emigrate. You can calculate roughly what the growth rate will be, out of that 1,000 individuals, right? So you just add the number of individuals being born together with those that migrate. So that's going to be 165 minus 37 minus 25, which will give you whatever that number is, okay? Now, you also have secondary ecological events. So secondary ecological events are all the other stuff that's going to then affect the growth rate. Now, that includes your limiting factors that are going to limit the population growth of a population, and the abiotic and the biotic limiting factors are all going to have a significant effect, okay? So the abiotic factors like sunlight, food availability, and natural disasters and so forth, those factors are what we call density independent factors. Now, they are called density independent factors is because the particular environmental condition is not reliant on how densely populated the population is, right? If you had 50 bird species, in a spot, and let's say a bushfire went through it, it doesn't matter whether there is 50 species, 50 individuals in the population or 20 individuals. The fire is going to kill whatever it's going to kill, right? So it's density independent. A fire will kill the individuals regardless of how many there are there, right? On the other hand, you can have biotic limiting factors. So limiting factors such as predation, competition, and disease, we track those, but we also have to be aware that those factors are what we call density dependent, meaning that the effect of the factor is going to depend on the size of the population, right? So, for example, a disease outbreak, that's going to affect a big population a lot more than it's going to affect a small population. The disease outbreak in a population of 1,000 is going to have a greater effect than the disease outbreak in the population of 100. Why? Because with 100 individuals, the disease doesn't spread as often. So that means that as the population grows, the disease or the effect of the disease is going to be more prominent and affect more individuals because there's just more of them around and it spreads and so forth. Okay, elephants, for example, if we look at a population of elephants, and let's say you're tracking that particular population of elephants, right? Something that you might want to look out for is the weather, right? So the weather, and you look at the limiting factor of the weather, for example, the temperature and the resulting drought as a result of that. And you look at the weather and it's going to be affecting these particular regions. And so what that means is by tracking the weather and looking at the temperature, you can predict, roughly speaking, how the growth of the population will be from areas that are really, really hot down in South Africa or areas that are a little bit more mild along these particular areas. And predict their growth rate based on that, whether it's going to have a negative effect or a positive effect. On the other hand, if you're looking at the biotic factors that are limiting, such as predation, maybe you're going to look at the habitat range of lions and track their population and see whether or not the elephants living in a particular region are going to be more adversely affected by being next to or within a region with a higher density of lions. On the other hand, let's say if an individual elephant dies and then you track the disease that's occurring, you can figure out, roughly speaking, how strong the effect of the disease will be on the elephant as a result of the size of the population of those elephants. Yeah. Now, by putting those things together, we can then determine the growth curve of a population, and the growth curve shows how the population grows over time, right? Very useful because, in generally speaking, healthy populations should be growing. Now, the growth rate will be different for every species. However, it should be growing. If it's not growing, it means that then we have to kind of go, okay, what's going on? What are the limiting factors that are biotic and abiotic? And which one's having a bigger effect? And how can we handle this and do something about it if it's for conservation? So it considers both primary and secondary ecological events, and you should expect different species to exhibit different types of growth. And in general, there are two types of growth to be considered. We have exponential growth and logistic growth, right? Exponential growth is when the population is going to increase exponentially. Now, in maths, exponential increase means it's not only increasing, but it's increasing faster and more rapidly, right? So you might start with, 2 in the first generation, 100 in the second one. But if all of them are successfully breeding, producing offspring, you might end up with 5,000 by the second generation. And then, generally speaking, over time, that should increase quite significantly, right? Bacteria is a really good example of exponential growth, right? If you leave bacteria alone, every 20 minutes, they will become 1 to 2, 2 to 4, 4 to 8, and then it's exponential in its growth because every generation doubles. And it has this kind of J curve shape that goes upwards like this, right? That exponential increase usually is represented by higher birth immigration compared to death and emigration. And in species that produce large numbers of offspring, you're going to expect exponential growth. So for example, when we think about like fish that produce thousands and thousands of eggs, if the environmental condition is favorable and really good, then you should expect exponential growth, because each one of those fish are going to survive really well because the environment is really favorable. And that curve over the next period of years is going to bounce back really well. So, if you look at a particular type of fish and you say, oh, geez, the fish is dying, what's going on? And then you remove the limiting factor, and then you should expect exponential growth in the fish back again, because it's now surviving, reproducing, and the fish naturally produce heaps and heaps of offspring. On the other hand, you can have what we call logistic growth. Now, logistic growth is when the population reaches what we call a carrying capacity, right? The carrying capacity is theoretically the maximum population size it could have, because the resources that are around in that environment is limited and density dependent. So eventually you're going to run out of that resource. And so at the start, growth is going to be exponential, but it should eventually slow down and hit a limit, right? And that limit is the carrying capacity, right? So elephants, for example, have a carrying capacity. So, even when parent elephants bounce back, they're going to grow really well, but they're not going to grow to overpopulate the earth. Eventually, the elephants are going to run out of, space, and they're going to run out of resources to eat. And that growth should taper off. It should actually eventually, taper off so that it matches the resources there. And new individuals being born are going to then eventually die because of the lack of resources as a result. So when we have a logistic growth, we should be expecting an S curve where it starts off as exponential, but then it should taper off eventually. And every species should have this. It just depends on how narrow, how broad that S curve is. It could happen really, really quickly right up along here and then cut off and taper off really soon. Or it could happen a very slow change over a very long period of time. Now, here is human growth curve over the years, and you can see here, this is a clear example of a J curve where the exponential growth of humans has, kind of really taken off recently. And the population, we've gone from a population from under 1 billion people somewhere in a couple of hundred years ago to now well and truly over 8 billion people today, and it's projected to only increase even more. And humans are actually one of the few species that we really don't have a carrying capacity, because we seem to know how to remove the limits of lacking resources. But it should be expected that we'll probably run out of stuff soon enough. Okay. All right. Well, that's it for this chapter. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I'll see you guys later. This is the last video of the series, and congratulations on completing the entire course of videos.